Can you hear me? Well, now that Timothée Chalamet is, on everyone's radar, people can pronounce my first name correctly. It's Timothée Verrecchia.
Timothée Verrecchia.
People used to say Timothy before Timothée Chalamet.
Okay, so I made the usual mistake. I would like to say special thank you to Krasi Genova, who actually put us in touch. This is the reason that you're here, and I'm very glad that your schedule allowed for you to jump by here in Sofia while traveling to all other places. I'll read very shortly a few sentences about Timothy, and then we'll jump into the main topic, because his portfolio and his personal history as a creative, as a professional, is very, very diverse, much diverse than usual, and then he will tell us more about all of that. So Timothy operates in the spaces where culture and commerce intersects, spending over 2 decades translating cultural undercurrents into strategic advantage for organizations like Apple, LVMH, and Carol Gardner's. His work spans the creative spectrum, from collaborating with luminaries in the film industry to working alongside tech giants and luxury brands. He's the founder of TV&P, a cultural hub that acts as a connective tissue between brands, talent, and industries across music, film, fashion, and media. If you have to simplify that a little bit and tell us, what is your business mostly about nowadays, what would you say?
I created a non-business. It's a non-company. Jokes aside, my business is really about helping brands and leaders, business leaders, understand and leverage culture as a currency. And the reason I say it's a non-company is that I essentially just built it on encounters and projects and my passions. So it started out with music and then went into fashion and ended up with Silicon Valley, but there was no big plan other than promoting the arts and promoting the music, the films, and the contemporary art that I loved, and that's how the business kind of came about. And it's been 25 years now of great projects across the board.
When you talk about cultural undercurrents, what kind of events and tendencies and processes are you talking about?
Well, our job is really to, like I said, it's to help brands do better commerce and more sustainable commerce, as in profitable commerce, using culture. So we, our job resides in in finding the perfect balance between commercial objectives and artistic projects. So we're always the kind of in the middle between the arts and commerce, and our job is only sustainable if we find that perfect balance. So if the artists who we work with feel like we're not being respectful of their vision and their work and their identity, we fail. And we fail at building a network of creatives who want to work with us. And if the brands that we work with and our clients feel like we're not adding value to their businesses, we fail as well. So the reason we've been able to sustain our practice and build our practice over the years and expand our business is precisely because we've always been incredibly mindful of respecting both imperatives. And we are really, over the last 20 years, we have been dealing with a generation of artists who do understand that commerce is not necessarily a bad word, but we've also been dealing with a generation of business leaders who understand that culture is very important. And the reason for that is that the consumers are in the middle. The consumers, all of us, are people who, listen to music, who go to museums, who look at the buildings around us, but we're also buying shoes, lipstick, and cars, and all those things. So we, the consumers, really are feeding off of both of these things. So it's been very interesting. The other important factor for us is that we've made our place across different industries because there's been disruptions in a lot of industries. I started out in the music industry. I actually started out in magazine and print, and that industry has been in perpetual crisis for the last 30 years. And then went on to work in the music industry. And the music industry, of course, went through, a very, very deep changes, towards the end of the 90s and early 2000s. And then went on to do work in advertising and fashion, and we work across film, we work across contemporary art, and all these industries are all going through disruptions. And the way we've been able to really kind of impose our mark and work with best-in-class brands and best-in-class business leaders is really because we strongly believe in changing the way things are being done. So that's always been kind of our motivation, to go into new businesses, is really to really reinvent the way things are being done. The music industry, again, had very, very significant changes to its business models. The advertising agencies as well. Fashion is obviously going through yet another crisis right now. So all these moments are, for us, they're great opportunities. I always say that, it's always more interesting in times of revolution.
In that sense, for example, you have a very, very big impact on the cultural program of Apple. Can you give us a few examples of one or two projects that you really like and you really care about that could serve as a good example of this unity between the commerce and the artistic field and the creative field?
Sure. I can give you one, and then I'll give you one in the nonprofit space, if you will, because a lot of the work that we've been doing so we've been working with Apple for over 20 years, and the work that we've been doing in the last few years has a lot to do also with the nonprofit space, which I think is very adjacent to culture and for reasons I'll go into. So one program that we started a few years ago was a photography program based around the iPhones that are launched regularly by the company, and I made a point to create a space for Apple that is, again, in culture. Apple traditionally puts a lot of resources and a lot of creativity and a lot of money into advertising, which I'm sure you've all been exposed to, and they do a really good job at that. And then they do a really good job also at the nonprofit space. I saw an opportunity for Apple, which has a very specific place in the way that brands use culture for historical reasons. I saw an opportunity for us to kind of really occupy a space that is really about culture. So it's not advertising and it's not nonprofit, but it really is about, again, touching audiences without an immediate commercial message. And so I created a program with photographers, world-class photographers, about 4 or 5 years ago, whereas before the launch of new iPhones, we work with engineers, we work upstream with the engineering teams to develop, to have world-class photographers use the new iPhone to create artworks. We just did that 2 weeks ago in New York, Shanghai, and London, where we showed the works that I commissioned with a photography duo called Inès and Vinoud, who are known for their work in fashion. The previous years, we worked with Brigitte Lacombe, Stephen Wilkes, so world-class photographers that we commissioned to create artworks that sit in spaces that, again, aren't just billboards or aren't just, museums, but really cultural spaces that we activate. So this is very new space, very new territory for us, and I'm really, really happy with it. I'm really, really glad. I hope you'll all get a chance to see the work that we commissioned, which will actually be shown across all Apple stores worldwide within the next couple weeks. The other project is actually shown on the screen here. It's not directly in culture, but I created a program with Carly Kloss, who is known for her work in fashion as a supermodel in America. And she came to us a few years ago because she wanted to support young women and teach them to learn how to code. And so as part of the work that I do with Apple, we supported her to kind of, get the program going. And over the years, we've helped her scale the organization, and today we're helping approximately 5,000 to 10,000 young ladies and transgender students learn how to code every summer. We create summer camps throughout America, and overseas, with remote operations overseas. So we've supported about 20,000 young ladies and transgender students to this day to learn how to code. And this is very important for me because, one, I think that, again, businesses today to be relevant need to be relevant in culture, but they need to be relevant more widely in society. So I think it's very important that that business leaders and companies like Apple really take a stand on education, on health, on social policy, on the environment, of course, and that they do it with meaning, with purpose, and with intent, and not just talk about it, but actually do really show good work. And I think that's a good example of it. And I also think that it's a great example. The work that Carly has done with us is really important because I think we're dealing with a generation of cultural leaders who are now able to take their cultural clout and their cultural influence and show social impact. So I think we're obviously all immersed in an environment where cultural leaders are on social media and they're on runways and they're in fancy places and all those things. But I think what's really interesting to me in the kind of greater geopolitical environment that we're in, to deal with cultural leaders who actually have a vision for the society that we live in. So I'm very attracted to artists and cultural leaders who are very mindful of social impact.
Well, I guess here it's a good moment to ask you a specific question. In an age of algorithmic feeds, how is it possible for a cultural movement still to evolve organically? Can we beat the feeds? Can we overcome that?
Yeah, I mean, people in the room are an example of experiencing culture and experiencing social experiences, not just on their devices. I think that we're seeing in music that live events are thriving. We're seeing not a resurgence, but we definitely seeing an opposition between the way people consume culture in the digital spaces as opposed to physical spaces. A lot of my work is really about legitimacy and credibility and sustainability, as in the way that things live over time. And I don't think there's an immediate opposition with the way things are consumed and promoted online or in the digital spaces. But I do think that people need to be constantly reminded of what makes us human, what makes us human. And I think culture makes us human, first and foremost.
How do big corporations nowadays who are in a more conventional business evaluate this cultural capital that you're talking about, the effort to involve culture in their dynamics to a point where they're part of a cultural movement, or they support it, or they're a sign of it, or anything of this nature? Are there any metrics that they use so that they can evaluate the investment?
Yeah, the metric is called money. It's bottom line. I mean, we deal with global businesses. We deal with leaders who are at the helm of companies that move culture at scale. So, and their mandate is always economics. So unless we create value and we add value and we understand business and we understand business strategy, we just don't get any work. So I'm not naive about this, and the way we've been able to again make our way into some of those executive rooms is because we do understand business, we understand consumers. But we work with companies who understand that the metrics that you speak of aren't necessarily quantifiable in the same way. They're not immediate. They're subjective, and there's very few of those brands. They're best-in-class brands. They're best-in-class brands and they're best-in-class leaders. It requires a very specific kind of leader to understand that, because because most leaders are under the pressure of their stock price, or all leaders are under the pressure of their stock price, and their metrics are very quantifiable, and they're very immediate. So there's very few brands who can afford to do the work that we do, because our work requires a different kind of thinking and a different rhythm. I mean, we do work on campaigns and launches, and we look at the stock price the next day with our clients. But a lot of the work that we do and a lot of the relationships that we have are very long-standing relationships. Like I said, most of our clients we've been working with for a really long time. And for instance, I'll give you another example. We've been working with Airbnb for about a couple years now, a year and a half, and on a global scale, and we're helping them relaunch their experience business, which is really about Airbnb becoming ultimately also a place where you can access all kinds of services, but our mandate is really about culture, so how can you come to Sofia and not just rent, a great place to stay, but also get access to the best of culture, meet artists, meet curators, meet chefs, meet athletes, meet all kinds of people. And so the work that we've been doing with Airbnb is really about educating them about how that requires a very different matrix and a very different approach to the way they're operating their existing business. So a lot of the work that I do is really about educating our clients and our leaders and teaching them the language of culture, helping them understand how artists work, and vice versa, helping artists understand how businesses work. But we're in a really good, interesting era, again, because all the old models are kind of being shattered. So it's a very exciting moment for us.
Since you're part of so many different creative industries, first, do you see something common between all of them, something which is underneath and it is like a unifying signature?
I'm sorry, common between what?
Something common between all of them, something which is underlying, and you could say that if you have that as a creative, then you can potentially develop with knowledge and dedication skills, and you can reach success in any creative industry, no matter if it is fashion, music, theater, cinema, or so forth, as a creative, generally.
As a creative, okay. Because I am seeing definitely something, an undercurrent, or like main trends across all the industries that we work across, which I can speak to. As far as creatives are concerned, the big trend that we've been really interested in, and again, the music industry is an interesting example for that reason, is that I think artists are now understanding that they are the top of the food chain. I think that a lot of the creative industries thrived for a number of decades on the notion that artists were at the end of the food chain, and that, the big companies would, they needed the big companies, like, for instance, like musicians needed record companies in order to make a living. And I think that's a fallacy. I think that artists are the beginning of the food chain. If in my work, if a musician doesn't write a good melody, if a filmmaker doesn't write a good script, or if an artist doesn't make a good painting, there is no business. There is no record industry, there is no film industry, and there are no museums, and there are no art galleries, there's no art fairs, there's none of that stuff. And I think that a lot of these industries thrived on the idea that they could control the artist and put them at lower in the food chain. And I think that artists now are understanding that they are very much at the beginning of the food chain, and they need to be much more responsible with the way that they build their careers, and they own their work, and they manage copyright, all kinds of things which are pretty boring, but are very, very important in order to gain control and to claim independence and to thrive. And so I think that's very exciting to me, because we're seeing a lot of these artists really, really kind of understand that and put their heads to owning their careers in that way. So that's very interesting.
You also mentioned that you see something underlying between the different industries that you were about to start talking about. What is it?
Everyone's in panic mode.
Right now, you mean?
That's the trend.
What's the reason behind that?
Yeah, no, I think and again, I'm excited about it in a way that not many people are, because I think that, so for instance, the film industry is in crisis mode for reasons that some of you may have heard. There's too much content. There's Hollywood has its own set of problems for a number of different reasons. Everything from tax incentives in the state of California to too many streamers asking for too much content. So the film industry is in crisis. The art market is in crisis because art galleries don't have access to the secondary market, and auction houses don't have access to the primary market. Music is going through its own thing. The fashion industry is kind of falling apart. And that's across the board, and they all have kind of their own kind of specific context. They all have, a lot of their own specific issues. So those are what I call kind of vertical crises. And then across the board, you have kind of horizontal factors, which again, we're all very well aware of, which is the geopolitical situation, the tariffs and everything else that's happening in the world. So that creates for a very, very kind of tumultuous environment, which again creates opportunities for us, because I think that you see business leaders kind of popping their heads out of the water and kind of understanding. Some of them understand that they need to change their ways, and it's also exciting for us because a lot of this is driven by consumers who kind of, we were just talking about this earlier. Consumers really see through what's real, what's fake, what's sustainable, what's very short-lived, and that's also very exciting to us. We function as consumers. We talk to our clients like consumers. Like I am the consumer of my clients. So I talk to them like a consumer, and that really helps, because we speak a certain truth at least.
In a state of crisis, usually people see opportunities which were not there before that. Do you see opportunities like this, both from the creative side but also from business side?
Yes, I see an opportunity to venture into, like I said, spaces that are kind of, for instance, the fashion industry, or I'll take the art market or the fashion industry.
Give us a brilliant idea right now, like a business idea that we can execute and just like skyrocket from Sofia to New York. I
don't know that I want to give you my great idea, but no, I mean, I think that the fashion industry is in crisis. I mean, I don't have the secret formula, but I am seeing that a lot of these industries are kind of all, if you look at, for instance, the film industry, everyone is trying to do what Netflix is doing, but that leaves space for people, for outliers, and for niche markets to do really strong work. And that's kind of the trend in every business. It's kind of like in fashion, everyone is doing the same thing, and it leaves space for people to go against the same schedule, or question the way, cycles and seasons have been imposed in the fashion industry, question the way most of the money goes towards marketing and not product, question the way, people are giving into a certain kind of, content economy or marketing economy. So I think when everyone's doing the same thing and going in the same direction, and there's a lot of kind of convergence, it always leaves space for people to really reinvent models, and that's very exciting. I was just in Paris yesterday, and obviously with everything that's happening in the fashion industry, we're now seeing mom and pop shops and like small tailors and small designers really kind of recreating very small kind of collections and brands that are the complete opposite of where the fashion industry is heading, which is faster, cheaper, more all the time, everywhere. And I think that's really exciting to me. And I can go on, but I think a lot of these kind of myths around these industries are kind of falling apart. And again, consumers see through it. If you look at the art market, the art market has been built around the myth that there's not enough artworks, and that's why artworks are so expensive. And actually, the art market is now suffering from the complete different, from quite the opposite. There's too much stock. There's too much artwork. There's too much artwork. Museums can't store them. So museums are, in the US are going bankrupt. Galleries can't sell them, and they can't grow their consumer base. So all these myths are kind of like changing in people's perception. But it's really interesting. It's, again, there's these big myths, and when they fall apart, consumers take over.
I know it's a common question nowadays, but according to you, how does AI change the whole landscape in the creative industries? And have you had any challenges related to AI in your personal work?
I mean, I'm like everybody. I try to keep up. I like to say that I'm part of the generation that saw the digital Big Bang. My first day in college, I had a pencil, and coming out, I had a computer. So I'm part of the old world. I think we're all questioning how AI is going to impact our lives in multiple ways, definitely in culture. It's obviously top of mind with everybody I deal with. And what's interesting is that I don't see anyone really I don't see any consensus, which kind of indicates I think we're still in the Big Bang. And I think we'll only be able to, if it ever slows down, we'll only ever be able to see what's come out of it in decades. It's very concerning to a lot of artists in the way that it's concerning to a lot of workers. In America, what we're seeing right now with the job market is that all entry-level jobs are being erased by AI in a number of industries, and a number of industries that were considered to be with high qualifications. And I think the same thing is happening to artists. It's just making it harder for people to start. That's the problem with AI. It's just, it's, as always, people who are established, people who have long-standing careers, people who have capital, people who have a brand are less threatened. They may be threatened one day or another, but at this stage, it's going to be really hard. It's just making it harder for, someone making his record in his bedroom. It may make it easier, but it's also going to make it harder to make a living out of it. So I think those are all things that we're all concerned with. I don't have answers.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you see something positive in the whole thing, because the concerns, of course, they're very important for the big picture, and they might be monumental for the future of the humankind on a more fundamental level. But still, if you see something positive, something that could be actually benefiting the society.
I'm French, so it's hard for me to see things positively. So if you look at the digital age, for instance, if you look at, I think that, the beauty of the digital age is that you have access to the history of art at your fingertips. When I was a kid, if I found out about a record, I needed to first read about it, and then I know this, it makes me sound like I'm 100 years old, but, I needed to read about it, I needed to, find money to buy it, I needed to go and buy it, so it was a whole process. And now, my 15-year-old nephew can just press a button and have access to the entire history of music, which is incredible, and and I think AI will accelerate that. At the same time, most 15-year-olds will listen to to the same songs, or to really whatever the algorithms are feeding them. So it's always the same thing. There's a positive use of these tools, and then there's negative use. If you look at new technologies, like in terms of the space that I work in, for instance, with some of my clients in Silicon Valley, those technologies can probably help, cure diseases, and can probably help create masterpieces, but most people use them for gaming and porn. That's the way we do things, So I think there's always positive usage, but there's also, and it's up to us to be very mindful. Humankind is a weird cohort.
So I have only 2 more questions, and then we'll see if somebody from the audience would like to ask you something specific. The first one is, what's your personal philosophy behind everything you do? Is there a broader net of thought that you use as a stepping stone? It could be a moral code, ethical code, broader philosophy that you care about.
I mean, humanism, you know, I'm interested in humans. That's why I'm here. You know, I've never been to Bulgaria. You were kind enough to invite me. I want to discover places. I want to discover cultures. I want to discover how people do things. You know, I've built my business around traveling the world for my clients. I spend my life traveling. Literally don't have a home. So that's the driving. That's really the driving kind of energy. Everything around it is just excuses. You know, I'm really good at finding excuses to go to places, whether they be people, artists, places, countries, cultures, industries that I'm interested in. And my business was built around that kind of curiosity. So I've been incredibly fortunate to work with some of the artists I respect the most, and I'm going to continue to do that. And that's really the driving motivation. That's and then, like I said, you know, having some kind of integrity with respect to artists and clients, and this notion that artists sit at the top of the food chain. That's really, really important for me. That's a lesson I learned when I was 17 in the music industry. I looked at a record contract and I was like, how is it that a record company makes 90% of the money and the artist makes 10%? And for me, from that day on, I was like, I'm always going to try to flip it.
I think this is one of the key points that everybody's going to remember, because it's good to hear that this could be a reality as well. Well, we are in Sofia, so I have to ask you, how do evolving markets like Sofia fit in the global ecosystem?
I mean, I think there's 2 points that I'm interested in. One is that I find that when you step out of the capitals, I mean, I spend a big portion of my life in Los Angeles, in New York, Paris, London. I think when you step out of those places, you find a very different kind of creative energy. You find when there's less economic pressure and less media pressure, you find a very different kind of creative energy. You find a very different community. And that's something that I've always been very interested in. So I try to split my time between those big capitals, which are very kind of pressured, and exploring places where there's less spotlight, because I find that it just creates, again, a much freer creative environment. So this is why, again, I wanted to come here, but this is also why I'm spending more time in Africa these days, or in South America. That's item number 1. And then item number 2 is, I think it's always interesting when, I don't know that evolving markets is the best definition, but when specific economies go through a tipping point where I've been to places over the last 20, 25 years that go through different cycles where people want to leave because they want to go to Paris to be a fashion designer, or they want to go to New York to become a filmmaker, or they want to go to London to be a musician. And then and then you get to another stage where people realize that they either need to come back home with what they've learned overseas, best practices, or they choose to stay home. And those moments are really interesting to me. And again, I don't know enough about Sofia, but I suspect that you have a lot of incredibly well-read folks and a lot of incredibly well-educated young people who now have the tools to really kind of, create an environment of their own, and create an environment where it's not just, the best practices that they've learned, but really anchored in tradition and in local practices and in the local culture. And that's really interesting to me. I've seen it happen in many, many different places over time. And those are the moments I like to capture. Yeah,
well, that's very curious, because here in Sofia, very often say to each other that one of the cool things of being here is that everybody could be entrepreneur relatively easy, because we as well, when we were younger, we had the idea to go and live abroad, let's say in Vienna and Paris, but in the best case we felt that we can be part of an already very well established system. And while being here, it's easier to create new things which don't exist, you know. Every lack of whatever is an opportunity. And this gives you a different type of satisfaction to be in the frontier of an evolving community, of an environment which is in the process of evolution very strongly. So what you've felt and noticed is very much relatable to Sofia and to Bulgaria. Well, I would definitely like to ask you if you have any questions to Timothy. It's again, great chance that you're here. I'm glad that we have this almost like a coincidence that you had the opportunity to come to Sofia. So please, if you have a question, now it's the moment to ask him. Of course.
Thank you very much. Fascinating discussion. I'm actually representing FollowArt, which is a network of curators and artists. And part of our mission is actually encourage the entrepreneurial thinking and make artists and curators own their power, not only in the arts, but beyond. That's also something that you mentioned. And if I understood well, you're acting as an intermediary between businesses and artists. And I have a very practical question. If we focus only on fine art sector, just to narrow it down, what are your ways to scout these artists? Like, do they approach you? Do you approach them? Do you have someone, again, in the middle? Yeah, I think it would be curious for maybe some people in this room. And how can these people come under your radar?
There's not one answer. You know, it's a lot of different tools. Again, I've been doing this for a really long time, so we have a very, very robust network of people worldwide, or I mean, at least in a number of countries. I can't say worldwide, but definitely a very extensive network. And we rely on them to. I mean, there's markets that we master better than others. You know, we've done. You know, my business is based in the US and has been for 20 years. We're French, so we know that market well. We've done a lot of work in Japan. So there's markets that we know better than others. As far as markets that we explore or new markets, and again, when I mean new markets, let's just say, or new environments, you know, maybe artistic environment or whatnot. My job is to identify people who know. So for instance, you know, the reason I'm here is we mentioned, you know, our friend Crossy. She's the one who's just been you know, really somebody who's been, you know, kind of a lighthouse here for me and has been, you know, educating me. I've been spending, like I said, I'm starting to spend more time in Africa. You know, it took me years to identify the person who would be kind of my guide. And it really is about putting in the time, you know, putting in the time to come here, putting in the time to go to Ghana, putting in the time to go to Uruguay, you know, and being on the ground and just being curious, but finding people who establishing conversations where you feel like, one, they're legitimate, but also showing that you want to educate yourself. It requires a lot of time. Like, it's very, like, I've been trying to bring some of my clients to Africa for years, and it's actually quite easy, you know, it's actually quite easy and quite cheap to go anywhere. You know, I came, you know, jumped on a plane today with a backpack and, you know, I had a great sandwich, and it's pretty easy, but, you know, people think that it's always kind of hard and whatnot, but it does require time. And, you know, to go back to our conversation, I think time is just a much more important currency than money these days. You know, it always has been. You know, I think people say time is money. I actually think that money is time. You know, so I keep telling my clients, I'm like, come, you know, grab a backpack and come visit, come meet the artists, go to artist studios. And like I said about Sofia, you know, or places that are in the evolving markets, the energy that I'm referring is that I found that when I go to these places, it kind of writes itself. You know, you go to one artist studio and then someone's like, hey, why don't you go here? And then you go across the street and then you go and then it requires time. The work that I do requires time. It just requires time and dedication.
use this microphone as well.
Okay, thank you. All right, thank you. You told that you work between businesses and consumers. And in this frame, if culture and art add value to business, where or how do you draw the line between engagement through culture and art washing?
That's a great question. I'm pretty good at being in my clients' faces. I think it's a number of things. Obviously, quality is subjective, but I think that, like I said, the work that we do is always about, balancing commercial objectives versus artistic objectives. So we work with a certain level of talent, and they're most of them, whether they're known or not, it can be the most famous film director in the world or a starting painter in Nigeria. They usually have very strong values, and they're very, their integrity is something that we look at very carefully. And I think consumers just see through what's fake. If you look at the fashion industry over the last 20 years, they've kind of corrupted everything from rock bands to the climate issues, because of the way that, these things have been, put to the short-term service of selling stuff. So I don't know that I'm answering your question, but there's no secret recipe. It's just we work with clients over a really long period of time. So if they come to us, and we have clients, and like I said, we've just engaged in a long-standing relationship with Airbnb. A lot of our due diligence is about, like, are you in this just to make a little bit of money, or are you in this to really move the needle? And moving the needle means for them making more money in the future, or at least over a long period of time. But for us, it means, like, are we able to do the work that we want to do? So for instance, I do a lot of nonprofit work on my own. I'm usually really good at bringing my clients, like, the Carly Kloss program was something that started with 15 girls. We're now at 15,000. I'm really, really good at putting my clients to the test. And I've also, one of the ways that we do that is I've always been very intentional on keeping my business very small, because if my business is not small, then we lose sight of that equation. Then we need to make more money just to sustain our operation. And that really, again, changes the equation. That's one of the ways that we do it. I have a very small business, and I want my business to be small and independent, because I want to be able to say no.
Okay. Please.
Hello, thank you for the interesting lecture. You said something interesting, and I would ask you to maybe interpret it some more. You said, I am the consumer of my clients. What exactly do you mean by that?
I'm their customer. I'm a customer. I use an iPhone. I go to Uniqlo. I rent Airbnbs. I understand them first and foremost. I don't have an expertise. I have the same expertise as all of you. I just go to them and I'm like, oh, like maybe, I do want to see more of this stuff in your stores. Maybe you should think about spending a little bit more money on the quality of your sweater rather than telling me you're fixing the climate. So I speak to them as a customer. That's what I meant.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, in this case, Timothée, Thank you so much for
Timothée.
Thank
Thank you so much.
Tim, thank you so much for being here. Please, let's have an applause for him.